What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 187. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to cover on today's show, including the U.S. hyping a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then I'm also going to be breaking down the fight between the Taliban and ISIS-K in Afghanistan. A lot of important stuff on today's show. Be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and I'm sure my listeners were all very involved and helped us out with our fund drive that we just completed. We hit our goal in just a few weeks. I really appreciate it to everyone who donated. Scott Horton, who runs the institute, said we had, several $100 plus donations. We had matching funds and everything, so it went absolutely great. I really appreciate it to everybody who donated. I know I've really been pushing that on the show for the past few weeks, and you all came out and really helped out. And so, that's going to help us continue to, do what we do and also increase the quality of the products we're putting out. And so stay tuned. Got a lot of great stuff coming on this show. You could share the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee. Also, we post on social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, and Twitter. It's up everywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And you could also support the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com has a great selection of CBD products. They're all very high quality, lab tested results. They are what they say they are. They work very well. I'm a big fan of their topicals. I use their sports cream most days. It really helps with any back pain that I have. I know other people like gummies for anxiety or higher dose stuff like the soft gels or tinctures to help with it and insomnia. So whatever you got going on, maybe CBD can help you out. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE, PEACE. That saves you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. All right, now let's get into the show and start off with the U.S. warning that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. On Thursday, Bloomberg reported that U.S. officials have warned European allies that Russia may be weighing a potential invasion of Ukraine, but the U.S. provided no information on how it reached this conclusion. The report cited unnamed people familiar with the matter and made it clear that the U.S. did not have information to back up its claim. The assessments are believed to be based on U.S. information the U.S. hasn't yet shared with European governments, the report says. Tensions are high in the region over an increase in the U.S. and NATO activity in the Black Sea and a migrant crisis in Belarus that the EU says is manufactured. The U.S. has also been hyping up the movement of Russian troops inside Russia, portraying it as a military buildup near Ukraine. So some of this stuff we have already discussed on the show in recent weeks. There was the report that from European officials saying that Russia was building up on Ukraine's border. It turns out that they were building up, scores of miles within Russia, closer to the border with Belarus, and an established, Russian training facility. And so it really wasn't a military buildup; it was just Russian troops movements. We covered the USS Porter, a guided missile destroyer, and the USS Mount Whitney, command and control ship of the Fifth Fleet, I think, is the Black Sea Mediterranean, sailing into the Black Sea. And then I also, in recent days, we had, I think this was all on like November 10th or 11th, 9th, 10th or 11th, the U.S. launching a U-2 spy plane from the U.K. that approached the Russian border, the Air Force having a E-8C over the Black Sea approaching the Russian border, and that was launched from Romania. The French also launched C-160Gs from Romania to fly over the Black Sea. The U.S. launched an RC-135 surveillance aircraft, and that approached the Russian border, and that took off from Crete. And then we had a U.S. Navy Poseidon P-8A approaching the Russian border, and that took off from Sicily. And so all this is going on in Eastern Europe, And also, as the UK, US, and other countries, including Poland, are moving more and more troops closer to the border with Belarus that it shares with Poland. Of course, this is all under the, we had to stop the migration problem, and I'll get into that in a couple minutes here. But it's look at all these military assets that the U.S. is moving even closer to Russia than the Russian troops are alleged to be moving towards Ukraine, and also all these other ships and aircraft that we have flying around. So I think this is all really important to kind of put into context, because the U.S. is really trying to, and I see this a lot in the mainstream media. All the headlines I've been seeing covering this story are saying that Russia might invade Ukraine, and this is what the U.S. believes. And the actual story, if you read the in between the lines, is a little bit more nuanced. They're saying Russia may be preparing to invade Ukraine, which does put another kind of step in the middle there. But at the same time, they really want to generate fear and hostility towards Russia, and that's what's going on here. And also the need to increase the American defense of Ukraine, which is very problematic. It's not that, I guess, there is no scenario under which Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine. This is something really important to the context of everything. Russia has pointed out that if the U.S. were to add Ukraine into NATO, and right now they are like almost a member state. A lot of U.S. politicians talk about like the U.S. has a defense commitment to Ukraine, just kind of complicitly. We sell Ukraine a lot of weapons. We deploy and run war games with Ukraine and other NATO countries. A lot of Ukrainian neighbors are NATO countries. However, it is not an actual in-name alliance of the U.S. And when push comes to shove, like in 2014, after the U.S. did a coup in Ukraine and Russia then took and annexed the Crimean Peninsula without a fight, but nonetheless, because I guess Ukraine wasn't a NATO member state, the U.S. actually didn't feel like compelled that it had to like go Article 5 and retake Crimea and go to nuclear war with Russia over that for Ukraine. And so there is some important differences between Ukraine, actually being a NATO member and the status that it has now. From the Russian perspective, the historical ties between Russia and Ukraine, combined with the strategic placement of Ukraine. Russia, I think, really sees this essentially as, Canada, should the U.S. have lost the Cold War, now joining the Warsaw Pact, is a country that shares a massive border with the United States. And, strategically, culturally, a lot of, going back long way, economic ties and everything like that. And so Russia, says that it's a no-go for Ukraine to join NATO, which is kind of an understandable position. And they have made, threats and military action around that. So unless the Biden administration is planning on adding Ukraine into NATO in the next couple of weeks, there's no reason to really fear a Russian invasion. So I think this is all hype, and I think this is more or less backed up by what the Ukrainians are doing. First, when the European officials about 2 or 3 weeks ago were saying that Russia is building up on Ukraine's border, it was the Ukrainian defense minister who was walking that back, saying that no, that wasn't happening. And we also have this interesting article here from the Daily Mail, and I'll get into it more later. But one of the things in the article is that Ukraine is actually moving 8,500 troops to its border with Belarus. And so while Belarus and Russia do have security ties, and maybe you could say, though, the issue is that they're worried about an invasion from Belarus, it seems that those troops are actually moving out of concern of migrants crossing from Belarus into Ukraine. And so again, if the U.S. is warning about a Russian invasion of Ukraine, wouldn't the Ukrainians be moving their troops to, either their borders with the Donbass region of Ukraine, which, is in open conflict with the government there and wishes to join Russia. Russia won't allow them to join, a very interesting part of all of this. But, they could be moving them there or to the actual Ukrainian border with Russia, but they're not. They're moving them to the border with Belarus, which at least suggests to me that the Ukrainians aren't taking this threat seriously, and it's just the U.S. attempting to generate some propaganda. So, anyways, there's this article here by the Daily Mail, and it's the Daily Mail, but they actually have a somewhat decent summary here of things that are going on, and so over the past, I mean, really throughout the Biden administration, this has been an issue. The Biden administration sanctioned Belarus months ago over allowing migrants to travel from North Africa and the Middle East through Belarus into Europe. Now, you know, all right. I guess let's just go through and explain what's happening here. Then I'll get into some background, more analysis. Anyways, all right, now I think there's about 4,000 refugees, and from the video I've seen that these people are living in really rough conditions. They're in what is being called a forest. I don't know if it's really a forest or not, but like definitely a wooded area, and it's winter. I don't know exactly. I should look up the latitude and everything here to understand, like, what it would be like living in the US, or maybe you would have to be all the way up in Canada. But, you know, just it looks very cold from the video. And so, these are poor people who have essentially nothing. It looks like they're even like cutting firewood and burning that to live, not to freeze to death, kind of stuff going on. Very desperate conditions. These people have traveled from the Middle East and North Africa. It's, I guess, unclear to me and everyone at this time exactly how they're getting there. Turkey has recently taken steps to bar Iraqis, Syrians, and Yemenis from flying from Turkey to Belarus. And so I'm not sure if they were like hopping on flights in Turkey, but what Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, the US, the NATO countries, Poland, essentially, kind of that list, that block of countries are alleging is this is a hybrid attack. I think the Polish prime minister actually accused Belarus of this being a case of state terrorism. And so this is, they're making various serious claims right now against Belarus for allowing migrants to travel through Belarus. Now, I guess there may be some validity to the claims. It seems that Belarus is at least not very interested in stopping them from traveling through their country to the border with Poland and into the EU. Ultimately, that's where these people are interested in going. A lot of people have made the dangerous trek across the Mediterranean Sea, through Libya or Tunisia, trying to get to, Sicily, Italy, Malta, or something like that, or closer to Morocco, maybe trying to get to Spain. But a lot of people drown this way. And another way people have tried to cross from these regions into Europe was going through Turkey, but Turkey really cracked down and essentially it has, I don't want to say blackmailed, but blackmailed the EU and other countries into providing them with international aid and funding to hold the migrants there, or else they will allow them to cross into the EU. And so, that's happened. I believe Hungary has had similar deals, not allowing migrants to move further into Europe as long as, that they receive a substantial amount of compensation for those migrants. I'm sure a lot of it doesn't actually end up in the hands of migrants to feed and clothe them and whatever. Belarus's case is maybe a little bit different, though. It looks like the leader is saying that he would, Lukashenko, would crack down more and prevent the migrants from moving through Belarus if the European countries would lift sanctions on his country. And I guess I could imagine a leader, and I'm not, this guy is corrupt. I'm not saying that, he genuinely means or anything like that, but a very populist-esque message that a leader can make in this case is, look, these countries are sanctioning us, right? And so, we could, if we weren't under sanctions, maybe have the additional funds to take care of these migrants, but we don't because of the economic war that our country is under, attack from your countries, right? So that kind of, I guess, does maybe make a little more sense. And also, like, from Turkey's perspective, right? A lot of these migrants, Syrians, Iraqis, Yemenis, Afghans, Libyans, etc., are from Somalis, stuff like this, are from countries that were destroyed by the U.S. foreign policy. And so, if you're not going to allow those people to like go to Europe, then and you're going to hold them in your country, that is going to incur substantial, costs, especially in Belarus, we're talking about thousands, but in Turkey, at one point during the Syrian civil war, we were talking about millions of people that they were taking care of. And so, I mean, that does get substantially expensive. So it's not all just like dirty tricks and using migrants. There are real costs here. And anyways, I guess I want to get into a little bit more of the background now, because I think we kind of see the situation, what's going on the border. This is, I guess, some issue for the European countries, for the NATO countries, if they would have to accept these migrants. At the same time, I think they're largely messes from, the American and NATO war. So you kind of reap what you sow. And this is largely what, the anti-war community has been talking about, particularly since I've been involved in it, like in the, early 2010s with the Libya situation and everything. If you don't want to have massive amounts of Muslims seeking to, gain refuge in your country, stop destroying theirs. It wasn't that, Libyans had always just, wanted to leave Libya and everybody just wants to live in Europe because like the weather's nicer or something like that. It's because, so many of these countries are either victims of colonialism, or more recently, America's war on terror, global war on terrorism, or, the funding that we give to dictators to try to control the world. And so even Egypt, going back to like the 1970s, we've been giving them millions, billions a year in military aid, stuff like this, propping up these governments on behalf of Israel. And so people are fleeing. It's just because of, again, like the legacy of European colonialism, particularly in Africa and U.S. world empire in North Africa and the Middle East, and Afghanistan, another important thing to mention. All right, so this is maybe a good point to divert real quick. And there's a really great article, I don't have it loaded up here, by Ramsey Baroud at antiwar.com. I say probably ran it about a month ago. And he talks about how there's like two classes of refugees or migrants or immigrants or whatever you want to call them, right? Where certain people are welcomed with open arms, right? Certain people the US will bend over backwards for to bring them to our country, like the Afghans who are trying to leave after the fall of the Afghan war. And then there are other people who the US will work to prevent from getting anywhere near the US, keeping them out of Europe, etc. And this would be, the people trying to flee across the Mediterranean Sea, the people now trying to get from Belarus into Poland, or examples of like Haitians, which we even after it seems at least some U.S. meddling in Haiti caused the recent instability there, Biden was deporting tens of thousands of those people who showed up on the U.S. southern border, even though they made a very dangerous and very obvious plea for asylum. If you look at the conditions in Haiti right now, the U.S. is recommending that every American leave the country, and yet we're still sending people who came from Haiti to the U.S. back to Haiti. And I think what they want or are generally to create things like the Cuban exile community, communities that are very interested in the U.S. or pro-empire foreign policy in their home country, right? Members of the MEK for Iranians who want to overthrow the Iranian government, they're welcome. These Afghans who fled from Afghanistan were fleeing from the Taliban, is the way that the U.S. saw it. These were the people that the U.S. had paid, even if they were bad people, the U.S. paid them for, the past 24 years, right? Or 20 years in Afghanistan. And so, they're very in line with the U.S. foreign policy. These are people who, I'm not saying like to a man or anything like that, but I think the U.S. thinks as a community will be for the US going back in Afghanistan, because that's when, at least for them, things in Afghanistan were best, when they made the most money in Afghanistan, and they're going to form ties with the US government and everything like that. And so if the US does go back to Afghanistan, these are the people who would be in position, who will speak English, who will have deep ties, who will be able to get contracts from the American government and stuff like that. And so from, I think, a world empire, a very shrewd position, there's a lot of value in these people's eyes, and inviting them into these Western countries, and then keeping out other people who were victims of the American or world empire foreign policy, like the Afghans who made the journey all the way from Afghanistan to Libya and then drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. The U.S. had wasn't picking them up from Tripoli and flying them into Italy or flying them to the United States. We had no interest in those people having to say a voice in the West whatsoever. We don't want them here, and that seems to be the same case with these migrants in Belarus, is that they're not going to have they're probably, not for sure, maybe they're fleeing Russian bombing of Idlib, Syria or something like that. But from what I could tell, from what the decisions that Turkey is making right now, again, they seem to kind of have their own Muslim ban. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I do know Turkey is a Muslim country, but they're not flying Syrians, Iraqis, and Yemenis. So these are three countries particularly impacted by the U.S. into Belarus. And it just all seems very disturbing and revealing of what the Biden administration actually thinks of, like, migration, immigration, and everything like that. It's far more shrewd from their perspective. They really don't care about people. Another way to look at this, by the way, I just read it this morning, the Biden administration has increased the number of people, almost doubled it, under ICE's essentially probation program. So, this is immigration enforcement. When they, people come to the U.S., I guess at times, if you're seeking asylum or different situations, I suppose, what they'll do is they'll allow you to come into the U.S., but they'll essentially place you under probation with ankle monitor at all and all. Or there's like a phone app thing that you have to like constantly have with you and verify that you have your phone with you. It's really disturbing. And so, yeah, it went from like 80,000 under Trump to 130,000 now under Biden. It's literally treating migrants as you would treat like a rapist who you let out of jail. Very very concerning. And again, I think just revealing of how they actually care and look at migrants. Now, we also have, I think, Belarus warning of a potential military conflict, and this came after, at the United Nations, the US, France, Estonia, Norway, Ireland, Britain, and Albania, and this was actually at the UN Security Council, condemned Belarus and said they were orchestrating the crisis. And so now, with the military buildup on the borders of Belarus is feeling threatened and saying that, like, hey, this could spark a military crisis. We also had Russia give some more guarantees of support for Belarus by flying 2 bombers over that country. And we also now have Belarus threatening to cut off some of the supply of Russian gas that in the pipeline that transverses Belarus. I think this is roughly 20% of the gas that goes from Russia into Europe. And, one, I guess, has to wonder if the, Russians probably are less interested in cutting off and avoiding the sanctions in this way that Belarus is, even though they do stand with the government in Belarus to some extent or whatever. They're not threatening to cut off their other gas. And I guess it's just very interesting, like with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and when it's about to come on, everything like that. This is, a big gas pipeline that runs directly from Russia into Germany, bypassing Belarus. If this, would be a way that actually, Europe has a little bit more leverage here in its negotiations with Belarus. It doesn't matter as much if they turn off that gas if you have new gas coming in through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. All right, I think that is all I have on the situation in Eastern Europe. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Definitely, the entire U.S. mainstream media is presenting this as a Russia manufactured, a Belarus manufactured crisis. NATO are the victims here, not looking at where these people are initially coming from, of course. U.S. war zones, and of course, just not having any sympathy for these migrants and where they want to live, which is interesting. All right, let's move on here and talk about Afghanistan, where we now have another report from the New York Times on the ISIS K, the alleged ISIS K safe house that was the target of the, what was it, August 29th drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 civilians, including 7 children. We've covered it on the show from, I think, the day after it happened all the way up until now. And the military investigating itself and finding that it did nothing wrong. What it also can't find is the ISIS K safe house. Now, what it alleged is that Ahmadi, who is the U.S. aid worker, works for a U.S. aid company who the U.S. targeted with this strike. What they said, that the reason that they thought he was in the Islamic State is because he went to his boss's home, also works for a U.S. aid company, right? They're Afghans, but they work for American California-based aid companies, right? He goes to his house and picks up a laptop. That is what they say ties him to ISIS-K. Turns out his boss's house is in ISIS-K. His boss has no ties to ISIS-K whatsoever. Neither of these two men have any more ties to ISIS-K than any other Afghans who live in Kabul, and are far more tied to the U.S. government, right? Like, they work for U.S. aid agencies. So anyways, they see this, surveil him for the next 8 hours, and then kill him. Also, something in this New York Times article that's worth noting is actually 9 seconds before they launched the strike, there were 2 adults and 4 children. And they say that Amiri's cousin was clearly in the video. Cousin was in the video that this entire time. His name is Zamiri Ahmadi, and his cousin being in the video the entire time makes it so that this strike didn't follow the regulations that was supposed to, of not guaranteeing civilian casualties. And it wasn't just, oh, we missed it. They knew they were there and launched a strike anyway, it seems, more and more. So this was an out and out murder. But anyways, they still 2 months later, or whatever it is, 2.5 months later, they still can't find the ISIS safe house. And so it's hilarious that there are still, well, not hilarious, it's absolutely disgusting, but it's comical that the U.S. government thinks that it could say it has intelligence and that's how it targets people with drone strikes, and then can't even identify homes of U.S. aid workers as not ISIS K hideouts, and they can't even find the real one. So what a joke the U.S. military is, and how shameful it is that they're going to let all the people involved with this murder absolutely off. Not even going to fire General Kenneth McKenzie, who's in charge of CENTCOM. And if nobody made a mistake, which was what the report found, that nobody made a criminal mistake that led to the deaths, then it is the person in charge of the organization who set all this up. So go Joe Biden, Mark Milley, Kamala Harris, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and then the head of CENTCOM, Kenneth McKenzie, all very responsible for allowing the murder of these people. It's just disgusting and unacceptable. Let's see. There is this interesting interview of the former Taliban finance minister on the number of ghost soldiers that the Afghan National Armed Forces had. And he actually estimates that it was, they inflated the number by 6 times to get the 300,000 strong army number. And that means that they only have 50,000 soldiers. He said that, the corruption was rampant in the government, and that, yeah, it wasn't as bad in his branch, of course, because nobody's gonna do an exclusive interview and admit a whole bunch of fault of their own. It wasn't bad where he was, but he says the corruption was really bad. Now, I mean, there's a couple interesting things here. That the Afghan army was this small explains a lot, right? How it fell so quickly. There's a hell of a lot less people that needed to surrender than the Biden administration was telling everybody. And even though I knew that there was a lot of ghost soldiers in the Afghan National Army, the fact that there's only a sixth the amount of soldiers that they actually claim they had is shocking. Now the other thing is this is a real problem for the Biden administration, because either they didn't know, and that has to be one of the biggest intelligence failures ever, to think that there's 300,000 people in an army that you are almost exclusively funding and there's only 50,000. Look, if there's a little corruption around the edges and there's 270,000 when there should be 300,000, that would be one thing. But we're talking about, for every one soldier that you actually are paying, you're paying for six. This is insanity. And that level of corruption that was going on that the US was paying for was absolutely unacceptable. So either the Biden administration didn't know this, and again, huge intelligence failure, absolutely being swindled by just local Afghan commanders. You can't go out there, drive out there, send a helicopter out there and ask him where his men are. He's only got 3, you think he's got 25 or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, this should be very, very obvious to the extent of the problem. Or the Biden administration knew, pretended that it didn't, pretended they had a 300,000 man army and this army was capable of holding back the Taliban, and then blamed everything on the Taliban, or excuse me, not on the Taliban, on the Afghan army for crumbling so quickly, when you knew you were just lying and they didn't have the army they did. So either way, this was really bad for at least the Biden administration, but really the whole US war effort in Afghanistan. Right now, the U.S. continues to brag about its withdrawal effort from Afghanistan, although they completely lost a baby. Still don't know where the baby went. Don't even know who stole it or anything, which, for the greatest logistical achievement in the world, seems awfully strange that you could completely lose a baby. But you also now have 1,300 Afghan children living in the U.S. Without their parents, and they really have no idea of when their parents are going to come or get here. And so this, again, it's one thing to evacuate a whole bunch of people from a country. It's another thing to actually do a good job of it. And so, they tout their number of, we brought 70,000 Afghans from Afghanistan to the U.S. Yay, didn't we do a good job? And no, you really didn't, because you separated a whole bunch of families and have no plans whatsoever on how to reunite them. Of course, I'm sure these children are, going through trauma, abandonment issues all the time, not being with their actual parents. And it has to be an absolute crisis. And they really don't seem to have a very good plan on how to fix all of this at this time. The U.S. did organize for 100 or so pilots who were members of the Afghan army. They hopped in their planes or helicopters or whatever as the Afghan government was falling, and they were flying like into Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And I think about 140 of them who made it into Tajikistan were actually held essentially as prisoners, and the U.S. has finally orchestrated them to fly at least to the UAE. They had chartered a flight between Tajikistan on the UAE. I'm not exactly sure, and I saw from some other reporting, it seems like their ultimate goal is to make it to the United States, and that is what the U.S. is planning on doing with these pilots. We have reports now that 300,000 Afghans have fled Afghanistan into Iran. Of course, these two countries share a very large border. Iran says they really don't have the ability to care for that many Afghans, and I believe I saw today that they're actually starting to export them. It doesn't seem like this is coming all in a single rush. As many as 4,000 or 5,000 Afghans are crossing every day into Iran, and so this is a slow trickle going over the border. it's unclear to me exactly who these Afghans are, if they are maybe Shia fleeing Afghanistan, particularly as the ISIS violence targets the the Shia minority in the country, the Hazaras, or if this is just whoever happens to live in Afghanistan near the border with Iran, and they're fleeing over because that's the closest place to get the hell out of Afghanistan. And if it's the second one, it may not be as much that they're fleeing violence, but rather fleeing the abject poverty and humanitarian crisis that's currently impacting Afghanistan. I'm reading a lot of stories that aid groups are now feeling the squeeze, that they think they have a limited amount of time before winter comes and starts to like shut off passes to some of these towns and villages. Makes it a lot more difficult, a lot more expensive to get in aid, especially without all the U.S. Military logistics in the country right now. And so we could be coming to a point where especially people in rural Afghanistan maybe freezing to death or starving to death this winter, and there's not a whole lot anybody could do about it. So that could be the reason people are fleeing Afghanistan too. I think a lot of times the assumption is that they're fleeing the Taliban. That may not actually be the case. It could be the economic devastation that America caused in that country. All right, so let's talk about this fight between the Taliban and ISIS-K, or ISKP, whichever acronym people want to use at this time. There's this really good article that I really like in the American Conservative today called "Making Another ISIS," and it gets into and does a very good job of talking about the flow of some former members of the Afghan security forces, the Afghan National Army, the Afghan police, the Afghan border forces, the people in Afghanistan who are bad paid, funded, trained by the United States, now joining the Islamic State Khorasan province. It doesn't seem at this point that there's a ton of people going over. I have no idea if the number is in the scores, the hundreds, the thousands, maybe hundreds of former ISIS, former ANA members are joining up with ISIS-K. And in the article, he kind of talks about the first reason is just the money. That the only reason that these people ever worked for the U.S. government is it was a good paying job. And now if your training is being a soldier and you were formerly members of the Afghan National Army, which means you can't go and sign up with the Taliban now because you fought against them for the past 2 decades, your option is to go to the Islamic State Khorasan faction, which is actively engaged against the Taliban, and they'll probably pay you. And so it's just a job, right? Like that's especially in a situation, for anybody who's sitting there going, oh, what a bad excuse, how could you possibly join ISIS? I mean, if people are starving to death, or we have reports out of Afghanistan of people selling kids. I'm not exactly sure if I believe all of those, but let's just say your neighbor sells one of their kids. Well, I don't know, maybe joining ISIS isn't quite as terrible of a decision to make, or you can certainly understand maybe a parent's decision to join a militant group like ISKP over selling your daughter into sexual slavery. This is like the level of decision that we've created for the people of Afghanistan. And so that really awful thing between letting your family starve to death, becoming a militant, and selling your children. I don't know what you choose there. And that's just the horrible situation that we've created in Afghanistan. Now, for the other reason, he rolls back to Iraq. And I thought this was really interesting. I hadn't thought at this point. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Talking about how not brilliant in the sense of a good thing, brilliant in the sense of understanding the Middle East and how these things work. So when the U.S. invaded, took over Iraq, and deposed Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi army still existed, and I think there were some like 500,000 people on the Iraqi army payroll. Now, the U.S. could have tried to build that army into the new government, or at least phased it out, but rather they just immediately got rid of it overnight, all these people unemployed, right? essentially you had the same thing happen in Afghanistan. Now, it did happen a little bit differently, but you do have similar dynamics where the Afghan government existed on, August 15th and it didn't on August 16th. That's kind of the way it worked. And so then you had, uh, you know, 50,000 at least, soldiers who were out of a job. Some number of those soldiers, want to continue being soldiers, and either because they hate the Taliban and now the ISKP is the best game in town for, joining up and killing the Taliban, or again, just because of the, monetary, the way it works, you need a job being a soldier. Well, now you essentially dissolved an army of 50,000 people, and all those people were looking for jobs where none existed. A lot of them end up going to ISKP. Now, I shouldn't say a lot. That's some of them, a number, and we'll hopefully understand the numbers of all this a little bit better later, go to ISKP. So, I think this is a really interesting, great article in the American Conservative. I think you'll definitely get a lot out of it if you decide to go and read it. One thing that makes me think that maybe there are a little bit more than has been reported so far joining ISKP is we have the Taliban, and this is a Taliban claim, and so they could be exaggerating or rounding up other people, but they say they've rounded up nearly 600 members of ISKP, and they've killed about 40, I think, since September or so. Again, some of these people could have escaped from prisons as the US-backed government fell, and then the Taliban rearrested them. And so maybe that's adding to the numbers, because I think people are very surprised to hear that, there were 600 IS members in Afghanistan to be arrested by the Taliban. I suppose it could also be a little bit of the denouements with the war in Syria, as some of the militants, I think, are looking to get out of Idlib, as the Syrian government and the Russians continue to bomb and push there. Maybe some Uyghurs trying to get back to China. There were thousands of them who had signed up to fight with the Islamic State, are now making their way back to Xinjiang, China, and they can do that by way of Afghanistan. So maybe there's people either rounded up in there that are being counted that maybe aren't actually members of ISKP, or they're just going from Syria to Afghanistan, taking up the fight in Afghanistan as the Syrian war continues to go in the wrong direction for the jihadists, although that is mainly at the hands of Assad and Russia. And then the possibility, too, that, maybe some of these people are former members of the ANA who went and joined up with ISKP and then got themselves captured. Now, ISIS continues to be a threat in Afghanistan. Just this morning, they planted some kind of mine outside of a mosque, and 15 people were injured. That was the latest report I had read, that nobody had been killed. And I think that's all the news I have on Afghanistan today. I think the humanitarian crisis coming there may be pretty bad. All right, a few stories on the Pentagon before we wrap up here. The first is this great article written up by Nick Turse at the Quincy Institute. Fun fact, U.S. Special Ops are in 33 of 44 countries in Europe today. And he's just going over in this article all the drills that the U.S. has going on. Albania, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Kosovo, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Montenegro, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, and the UK. That's a hell of a list of countries to have troops deployed into. These are SEALs, Green Berets, top tier special operations forces. And, just when you remember, and actually, referencing back to the first thing we talked about in today's show, the tensions in Eastern Europe. So many of these countries are in Eastern Europe, and this does add to the tensions that the U.S. has with Russia, with Belarus and stuff. All right. Now let's look at the Army wanting more space tech. This is a interesting article that I found where the Army has signed a contract with Capella Space, and they are looking to produce different kind of technologies that will benefit U.S. soldiers when they put them in space. And so I guess this could be air and missile defense, long range precision missiles, so actually, putting weapons in space, GPS type systems, radar, uh, like if you have a satellite, you could have constant monitoring of over the troops overhead, right? Kind of like drone technology, except you probably don't have to worry quite as much about running out of fuel all the time. And if you have enough satellites, this monitoring, I guess, could be essentially constant. And so this is one of the things going on. Very interesting. They say the contract is hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I expect it to continue to increase, although there's not a lot of actual details in the article about how much the U.S. Army will be paying in for what technology. We also have the general who is one of the commands of the National Guard, General Dan Hokanson, telling that he is watching closely and involved in the debate to create a space National Guard that would give the Space Force its own dedicated National Guard. And so this is an interesting idea being pushed forward. I guess they say here they estimate that it'll cost $500 million a year to do it this way. I'm guessing it'll be inefficient and a boondoggling and just, extra reasons for military spending. The Pentagon is giving Boeing, the company that just admitted that it can't keep civilian planes in the air, a $136 million contract for 4 Chinook CH-47 Block 2 helicopters. Now, one of the things to note about these helicopters is they're already missing the initial specs that the Pentagon was hoping for. They were supposed to carry these new advanced rotor blades that would be able to lift an additional, I think, 1,500 pounds each. So I think that would be 3,000 total pounds of load on these helicopters. However, the development for the rotor blades has not happened, and so they're just ordering older and less advanced versions of these aircraft. So Veterans Day was yesterday, and Biden gave a speech, and most of it was just blowing smoke, but maybe some a little bit of good news to wrap up today's show on, and that is Biden said that he ordered his administration to provide better medical treatment for veterans exposed to toxic air and to study the diseases they may have contracted while serving. And so what he's talking here is the burn pits that the U.S. had across Iraq and Afghanistan during the wars there. I'm sure the number of Iraqis and Afghans who have suffered from these burn pits is even higher than the U.S. troops, but we've had hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. troops develop crazy cancers and die because they were essentially throwing old munitions, body parts, medical waste, like tires, military equipment of all kinds into big pits, throwing a bunch of jet fuel on it and setting it on fire. It would be like the military base in the town of Springfield from The Simpsons, and everybody's right by the giant burning tower, tire fire, and wondering why they're catching cancer and everything like that. So the U.S. has essentially done nothing for this for 15 years, and now we have Joe Biden, who seems to only care because his son was likely impacted by this. Beau Biden, not Hunter. This isn't the cause of his crack addiction, but Beau Biden, who was a more reputable type of guy and likely kind of would have been the heir to the Biden name had he not been killed by an aggressive brain cancer that could have potentially been linked bad to the burn pits. And so very interesting. And they actually have quoted in this article Biden saying, because of the exposure to burn pits, in my view, I can't prove it yet, he came back with stage 4. I don't want to try to pronounce the name of the cancer. It's a stage 4 cancer with some kind of brain cancer, I think, that he had. And so Biden actually looking to increase this is a good thing. Like, the suffering that these vets are undergoing is unfair. Hopefully, the U.S. would also look at providing some sort of compensation to the Afghans and Iraqis who were exposed to these burn pits as well. That would be very important. And also maybe looking into, especially, a lot of these were young men, right? Not that there weren't U.S. women over there, but I'm guessing not a huge number of them were pregnant. Whereas, for the Iraqi women who are around this and were pregnant, potential birth defects or something like that, lifelong conditions that Iraqis will suffer under because of these burn pits, and also holding the U.S. companies who profited off of these burn pits, the ones who got the contracts to roll them out, financially accountable for running these burn pits the way they did, and taking all the money back the U.S. government paid, at the very least, if not actually, making them pay out to the veterans and their families as well, those who have died and been exposed here. So, it is kind of shameful the way Biden did it, unrolling it in this propaganda of Veterans Day. He should just, the first day he walks into office, signs an executive order on this and, gets the ball rolling, pushes forward in all of his, defense bills and spending bills and everything like that. But we haven't seen any of that. And, it does give me a little bit less hope that this is going to be a serious measure in the Biden administration to actually get these young men care. And very disappointing that he's only really interested in caring for the American victims of these burn pits. But nonetheless, it was a little bit of a bright thing to end the show for the week on, because I know it's almost always bad news, guys. All right, thank you so much for listening. Continue to share, support the show in any way you can, and I'll be back with more shows next week. Thanks, everyone.